There's a person in almost every family who asks the questions no one else thinks to ask. They're the one opening dusty boxes in the attic, reading the backs of old photographs, tracing names through faded documents, and wondering who the people were whose lives made our own possible. They become the keeper of birthdays, recipes, migrations, heartbreaks, and triumphs. They gather the scattered threads before they disappear. But becoming the family storykeeper isn't simply about preserving the past. It's about understanding ourselves. Because every time we uncover an ancestor's story, we're also uncovering a piece of our own. My guest today knows this journey intimately. For more than 20 years, writer, filmmaker, and podcaster Erika Hanchar has been tracing her Ukrainian family's immigration story to Canada. What began as a curiosity became a lifelong pursuit, one that led her across oceans, into archives, through family records, and back to the villages her ancestors once called home. In this conversation, we talk about what it means to become the family storykeeper, the lifelong search for identity, returning to the homeland, and why preserving the stories of ordinary people may be one of the greatest acts of love we can offer future generations. Hey everyone, I'm Yamuna. Welcome to the first season of The Long Road Home, a podcast where travelers, storytellers, and culture makers I've met along my global journeys share the stories behind their paths, their roots, the roads they've traveled, and how those journeys have helped them find their way home in the world and within themselves. I'm so glad to have you here with me. Let's go. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Long Road Home. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Erika Hanchar to the show. Erika is a Canadian writer, director, photographer, and podcaster whose work explores immigration, identity, family history, and the enduring power of storytelling. She began her career in film as a stills photographer before attending the Humber School for Writers as a recipient of the Kobzar Scholarship. Her writing has been recognized internationally, with her manuscript, The Warsaw Servant, named as a finalist at the Palm Beach International Book Festival. And she recently wrote and directed a public service announcement in collaboration with Women in Film and Television in Florida. Her podcast project, The Granddaughter of Immigrants, is a deeply personal exploration of her family's immigration journey to Canada and the ways our ancestors continue to shape who we become. Erika, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to The Long Road Home.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by talking about some of our similarities because although we have not met in person, are somewhat of a kindred spirit. We are both storytellers, writers, we're both podcasters. I found out that we were both portrait photographers in previous iterations of life. We're both archivists, and our mothers had daycares when we grew up. And We're also, Canadian. And I think both of us have the forever identity crisis, as you have mentioned in your podcast. And so it's pretty amazing to meet a person out there in the world that I feel like is so similar to me. And your podcast, which is something that I gobbled up probably in about a week, Granddaughter of Immigrants, is such a beautiful tribute to your Ukrainian heritage. And I would love if you could just ground listeners in the synopsis of your show and what it is that you're exploring.
Yeah, no, Granddaughter of Immigrants is it's funny. It's a podcast miniseries that is made of under 20-minute episodes, except for the after show, which is the last culmination of everything that we've learned in the podcast. But Granddaughter of Immigrants, the story is of my family and my family's immigration over the last 125 years from Ukraine to Canada. And it came to be after a long journey of just trying to build a family tree and being kind of unsuccessful until I found a DNA match that prompted this entire story and prompted me to go looking back and really dig in and find out what were the lives like of my ancestors and what was it like when they came to Canada, or just what was it like when they left their home country and what were they struggling with. Even though I grew up with them to a degree, I didn't really get to know them because they were a lot older. They were older grandparents, and they didn't talk about anything. Like most immigrant grandparents, they did not share their stories because they were potentially ashamed. They were really tragic stories, and they were at really pivotal points in history that I later learned, especially with the state of Ukraine right now, how important these stories are to keep telling them. And so that turned into a podcast where I dug deep into most of the ancestors that I could find, and telling their stories, be it long or short, in an episode. And mostly to kind of teach the rest of my family, where they came from, like my nephews and even my sister who wasn't aware of, our ancestor story and how they got here.
That's amazing. And I know your show just wrapped up. I listened to, I think it was episode 20. I finished it yesterday, which was fantastic. And I know you're just about to go and celebrate the ending of all of this with your family, who must be so proud of you for creating this and doing all of the work. And I think it's been 20 years. Is that correct? 20 years you've been investigating all of this?
Yeah, 20 years investigating it. So 20 years ago, my grandparents passed away. And even though, like I said, I knew them, I didn't know their story, but they'd left behind like a stack of documents that were cryptic and, in other languages and from time periods that I didn't understand and war times that I'd never learned about in school. So I started digging into that, and it just took 20 years to really pull it together. And I don't even have the whole story. I just have, what's available. There's not a lot of history online about individuals for the Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian nationality. And because it's just a country that's been cut up so many times that it's really hard to track that stuff. It's not like being Irish and you can find everything you need on ancestry.com. I really wish that was the case for me. But it took 20 years with hiring private investigators to look for family, to find villages and translators, translating documents, and me just learning tons of history so that I could even understand it. And then eventually learning Ukrainian, not very well, but like learning it enough so that I could understand it too. And then talk to some family that I still have in Ukraine. I'm very lucky to have them.
That's incredible. I really sympathize with all of the efforts because I have, Irish on one side, which one of my family members has done an incredible job at investigating birth and death records, which were kept for hundreds of years, baptismal records. But on my Indian side, there's nothing. There's completely nothing, to the point that most of the information that has been captured is wrong. You'd go to school with your kid and they'd say, when was this child born? And they would just make up a date. There's a lot of made up information because they were just not record keepers. So you've done a remarkable job with what you've had to work with. And I'm thinking of episode 1. I can't remember the title of it, but I know you had introduced the Kobzar. That's it. I know you had introduced us to this idea of the Kobzar, who is a person who traveled village to village, singing, the histories and collecting stories. Would you consider yourself like the modern Kobzar of your lineage?
Of my personal lineage, yeah. So the Kobzar was this traveling bard, in the 1700s, maybe even earlier than that. I don't know how far back the history actually goes, but what I learned was that during times of oppression in Ukraine, the language, the stories became suppressed and they weren't allowed to talk about them. But there were these traveling minstrels. Some of them were even blind, and they would go around and they would play instruments of Ukrainian heritage and sing songs, and they would teach about histories of Ukraine and teach about the language and teach about the literature of, many centuries before, these ancient stories. And they would go to these small villages and teaching kids and families, just going across the countryside. And sharing these stories. And that was the only way to do it back then. And during these real oppressive times, where they could be caught, like they were kind of like, almost, I don't want to call them religious figures, but they were like trusted like religious figures, right? That they were the good guys, and they, no one was going to come after them and stop them from sharing these epics. And so I use the Kobzar, and the story of the Kobzar, and the concept of the Kobzar to kind of fuel my own personal quest to fulfill my family's story, right? So we don't have all of these perfect documents. We don't have all these perfect digitizations of our past that we can share. So what we have is some stories, and I can pinpoint them on maps. I could pinpoint them in parts of history. And so when you can kind of lock in your own personal story to a historical moment or just a place and time, then I believe that that's what I've done for my family, is kind of created this sort of, I don't know, Kobzar legacy. I feel like the Kobzar is like, way up there. He's like up on a pedestal, and I'm just like a person who's following in the footsteps of the teachings of such. So I think we all can be a Kobzar, though. I think that we can all kind of like walk in the shoes of a Kobzar and say that, we're preserving our family's culture, individual families. That's how you can be a Kobzar for your family. Don't have to be sharing the epics of your country's lineage or the culture of, thousands and thousands of years. It can just be, like 100 years of your own family that you pass on to the next generation, so they can kind of start learning about your history where you left off, giving it to them, and providing it to them.
Yeah, piecing their story together. I really loved the director of the Shevchenko Museum had discussed sort of like memory as an act of defiance, specifically with your lineage and the Ukrainian culture, with the genocide and other things happening historically, that this preservation of memory was like an act of defiance in itself, to continue this living archive of the stories of your people. And I really appreciate that idea, because I do feel that we forget. Not just we personally, but collectively. It's like history repeats itself again and again. It's like we have this sort of permanent amnesia, and we forget about the things that have happened. And so I really loved that idea of memory as an act of defiance. And in your trailer of your podcast, you mention that your story is both your punishment and your purpose. What did you mean by that?
It's... The punishment is that this is a story I'll never finish, right? So it'll taunt me for the rest of my life. And that's okay. It's something I'm willing to have as a part of who I am. It's the punishment is that I had the interest. So I tread here lightly, because there's so many families that have like one person, who is the family documentarian, the person who takes all the photographs, the person who collects all the family documents and knows all the great grandparents' names and histories, right? And I think that that's a punishment as well as it is a privilege to have, because once you have to share it, right? So it's like, and I feel like it's more of a feeling than it is a job that was put on me by any means. Like I, for some reason, as a child, was interested in this when no one else in my family was. And so it's my responsibility, right? It's a punishing responsibility, because it's as much as it can be satisfying, it took 20 years for it to turn into something. For me to say like, oh, here are some people, like it can take a really long time to find people in your family. It can take a really long time to pull together a story, to understand. You have to understand a lot about where you come from and what that place was like in order for it to feel like your story. It's a punishment only because it is just one of those things where it's gonna be part of my story for a really long time. It's gonna be my whole life, basically.
Like an obsession.
Yeah, exactly. A good, healthy obsession. But yeah, it's also like one of the most satisfying things I've done in my life.
I can totally relate.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I think the archival work is so tedious, and yeah, it can be very obsessive, but I feel like there often is one person in the family who takes that on, and some families don't have that person, and those, bits of history, I guess, get scattered in the wind and don't carry on. But I think what you've done with your history is quite remarkable. And I know that a lot of people have been enjoying your podcast, even without Ukrainian heritage like myself. It was very fascinating to know more about peoples who live around me here. And, I didn't know much about it. So how has your family responded to all of this?
Well, to be honest with you, the podcast kind of was prompted by, the death of my father. So I don't really have anyone left on that side of the family except for my sister and my mom. And they love it. They're like, my sister is so engaged now in our heritage and our culture and our family story, and has been able to find pieces of the story that really resonate with her. And in our last episode, which I call the after show, we talk with a life coach about the traumas and everything, but also about how my sister felt about feeling connected to her family for the first time, like her distant family, the people who'd been gone for a really long time, who she didn't spend any part of her life with. And just like kind of, I guess, the symbolic nature of knowing who those people are and what they represent, and finding people who are like you and saying like, oh, these are like my tribe, right? So for the first time, my sister was able to really feel that, which is a feeling that I've felt for a long time because I've been doing this research. But for somebody who wasn't my sister's not the Kobzar, I guess you could say, of our family. But the story helped her find where she connected with people in our family that are no longer here to actually have relationships with. And I think that's really special, because I think, even back to some of the other things that you were saying too, about the intro and, how I talk about the Kobzars, I think we forget that that history and these people in history, they started out as just regular people, right? Like they're your mom or your dad or your grandparents. Like these are, these stories come from regular people. And it's nice to kind of finally see, a connection to someone who had such a great life in your family, or even just somebody who had a regular life in your family who feels like you. You don't have to have like kings and queens related to you in order for your family story to feel important, or for you to want to research it. It doesn't even matter. There's so many little victories in the research. You don't know who's going to resonate with what in your family. But I feel like that there's a real reward in finding a personal connection to somebody that you've been researching, like a great grandmother that you didn't know maybe was a single mom. Like that was something that my sister had a connection with. She was a single mom at one point. She had young boys, and so did, a grandmother of ours. And she found real connection in that. And it was something that grounded her in our family story, made her feel like she was a part of it. So me doing all the research for this, as much as it was for me and it's my obsession and it's my hobby that I turned into a podcast, it was created so that somebody could make a connection like that, like my sister.
That's
and I think
beautiful.
that's why we all should do it. You never know who's listening, right? You never know what kid is, 6, 7 years old now might pick up on this later. It might resonate with them. So
absolutely. I love that. And I wonder, I know that you've spoke to this a little bit in your podcast, but, how much of our identity comes from the lives of our ancestors, or, I guess, how do we navigate some of those difficult histories that we come in contact with, and how much of those do you feel like were part of who you became without even knowing it?
The difficult histories?
Yeah, or just, I know in your podcast you talked about like alcoholism on the masculine side, and there was obviously a lot of trauma, but because you didn't develop, I suppose, this not even the interest, but the understanding of things in your family until much later, was there a journey for you to sort of understand yourself and understand how you became who you are based on who your ancestors were?
Yes. I think it's a 20-year journey. I went through a lot of ebbs and flows of who I thought people were and who I thought I was. In the end, especially because I was able to reconcile a lot of these stories with my sister and hear her point of view as well, like where we could both discuss some of these horrible histories and, maybe the actions of some of our family members that were more of the negative storyline. I think that I got to realize that I feel like if I didn't have this conversation with my sister, like if we didn't get to enjoy it and figure it out together and discuss it together, that I would have a really one-sided view of how my family was. Like, I think it's really easy to hear a bad story and to have your moral beliefs and your disposition and say, I would never do that. I'm not an alcoholic, so I don't relate. I didn't go through a war, so it's, I don't understand. But I think that in discussing it after the fact, after the story was told, after we established, like, yes, these are some dark, dark histories in our family, and we are accepting them for what they were, and we are discussing how we feel about them in a present day. I feel like that was really healing, because I think I had, especially this entire journey, this feeling that there was going to be something bad around every corner, that nobody wanted to talk about our history because it was so ugly. And there was something in there that was going to make me maybe not like them, or, lose respect for my family, or, just find out something that I would not just personally want to know about. But in even still, like, there were some really dark stuff, but even still coming out and having the opportunity to discuss it as an adult and to, I want to say forgiveness for some of the actions of some of the people, in my family who, maybe were alcoholics and, didn't act great all the time, and kind of have some more understanding for, how generations of trauma can really come through for many, many years, right? And the last show, the after show, Ann Papayoti, she was like, one very serious trauma not dealt with can ruin a person's life. It can affect people for many, many lifetimes, or a family for many lifetimes. And that is something that happened to us. And then my sister and I sitting there talking about it, and we're like, this doesn't have to go on anymore. Like, we can literally stop this. We don't have to have this move forward in such an ugly light. Like, we can reconcile this whole entire story right now by just understanding it and facing it head on, and, accepting it for what it was. And, whether you accept the behavior or not, but you have to accept that it happened, and then moving forward in a totally new and positive life while accepting everything that's happened in the past. So
I agree with you. And I feel like I have, touched on it a little bit in the Storykeeper series, where, it's really about like transmuting the past and understanding it, but then really choosing what story you want to write with your life.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's exactly what you've done. You've taken this history that's got some dark places, some beauty and some heartbreak, but have really transformed it into a gift for your lineage and for anybody who comes in contact with stories. Because I think what it really does is pulls each and every one of us into our own stories and asks ourselves, what the identity of our ancestors means for our lives, and how we can live fulfilling lives in the modern age, and integrate all of these stories and have respect and honor for the places that we've come from and how they have shaped who we are today. So that's definitely what I've taken away from your beautiful series.
Thanks.
And you're welcome. I wanted to know, like, have you been to the Ukraine, and
Mhm.
if you have, what was it like to stand in the place that your ancestors once called home?
Yeah, I've been to Ukraine a couple times. The first time I went was when after I'd hired a private investigator to help me find my family in Ukraine. Well, I say find my family, and I didn't even know I had family there. I was just taking a shot in the dark. And the first thing they said they were going to do is they're like, we'll do the simplest thing. We'll phone people with the same last name as you until we find somebody who's related. Like, that's the easiest thing we can do. And
Great idea.
Well, and also too, like at the time, I didn't speak the language, but also I wasn't going to make all these random phone calls and try to mitigate what those responses would be on the other end. You just calling somebody in a completely different country, speaks a totally different language, you've never heard of you, and just ask if they're your family. It's easier for the private investigator to do that. So basically, I hired a private investigator to make phone calls for me. And it was the best thing I ever did because he found someone very quickly. And they invited me to come and visit. And I did. And that was in 2012. And so my family's from Western Ukraine in near Ivano-Frankivsk, which is far, far west, like in the Carpathian Mountains. And they are in a small village called Khostiv. And that is the site of where my grandfather and my great-grandfather and grandmother lived. And it is the site of a lot of the podcast where my stories kind of are birthed from. And so I got to go there and I got to stand, I got to walk the streets and got to stand on the same property that my grandfather's house was built on. It was burned down during World War II. So it was rebuilt by his family, his brother, and who's my great uncle. And that's where their family house is now. And actually my whole family, they're a big family and they have quite a few houses on that street now, which is really nice. It's a small village and it has a school and it has a post office and it has a corner store and it's just got the best farmland in all of Eastern Europe. And it's just a stunning little hillscape of farms and greenery and just, I don't know, peaceful country life. I was kind of beside myself the whole time I was there. It was like a fever dream. I think about it now. I think about it now and I'm just like, I don't know. I have pictures. I know what it looks like. I know it was real, but I have this like real vision in my mind of what it was like because it was just so many years of researching and trying to find these people and trying to find this place and trying to make a connection to it. And to get there and to finally stand there, it's kind of like when the kid finally gets to go to Disneyland, like
Absolutely.
you're watching the movies for so long and then you get to be there. The only thing was that as much as it was a wonderful trip and I loved it and it'll always be, it's part of my identity, just going there. But my family didn't live there anymore. Like these were extended family, cousins, these were my grandfather's brother's children. And so they were like cousins and aunts and uncles, but it wasn't my grandfather. I mean, my grandfather passed away at that time, but I went there kind of looking for like this, I don't know, this feeling of like really belonging. And it didn't exist there for me. The culture, it was so inviting. The people were so wonderful. But I was like, wow, I thought I would be overcome with this, like, yes, I finally found my place. I finally feel true identity here. And I thought it would just happen automatically. Like, I don't know why I thought that, but I just did. Maybe it's just because of so many years of researching it that I put all my eggs in one basket and was kind of hoping for that it would fix something within me. Like as far as the feeling of, missing family and, not having a homeland, like, and not having any stories because remember, my family never told me anything about their lives. Everything I know is because I learned it after they were gone. So to not have that feeling, that rush over me, like when I got there, like, yes, I made it. Like I did it. Like we're back here. It's been 80 years since my bloodline's set foot here. And it's,
wow.
And I just didn't feel it. And, it took many years to feel connected to that culture because I kind of had to make those connections on my own. It's not like, a kid who grows up in an immigrant home and like they see this stuff all the time. I had to learn it all for the first time after the fact. Now I feel like that. But at that moment when I went the first time, I didn't. And then I went back again the second time and it was better. It was more, I went and I volunteered with a children's camp for a couple weeks in the summer. These are kids who've lost parents during the war, and they get to come and kind of experience what camp is like, and they get all kinds of services. It's called Help Us Help. It's a Canadian-Ukrainian foundation, and so I went there and I experienced kind of like a camp life with like kids who are from Ukraine. And we did really cool things. Like we climbed a mountain together, and I got to take a lot of photographs for the camp. And then I would go and visit my family in the village, and just having a grounding experience in the country that was more than just a visit, that was more than just seeing tourist attractions. That really
Definitely.
helped. That really changed. It changed my life. It changed my perspective. Not really perspective. It changed, I guess, the story that I was telling myself about, do I belong here? And because I actually had my own memories there now. So it was really nice. And then that second time I got to learn how to cook from my family. They taught me culturally how to cook Ukrainian food, and, just spending time with like the elder women of my family was very centered. It centered me, and it helped me feel like I belonged just a little bit more. But I'll tell you, the feeling of trying to make a connection to a new place, when you're not even trying to live there, you're just visiting there, you're trying to make a connection to this culture. It was very difficult, like to feel it after you were gone from the place. I had to work really hard to learn the culture on my own when I was back here in Canada. And I didn't start to really feel it until I started to really learn my family's story.
That's such a remarkable story, Erika. And like I resonate with so much of that, although we've had different experiences as I'm a child of an immigrant, a recent immigrant, and our families all live in India, for example, on my mother's side. But even then, I grew up with very little understanding of how that culture had really impacted me or made me, certain ways. And until I went back to India, and then I was like, wait a minute, how come I think like this or I do things like that? Would you say that you've resolved the identity crisis, or would you say that that's still something that you feel?
I've definitely resolved it in many ways. As you'll learn, if you listen to the podcast, and I will give you the spoiler, which is okay to explain my identity crisis. So my whole life I'd been collecting all these stories, thinking that I was going to find identity in them. And then I met a family member who needed the stories more than I did. And when I passed on those stories to the next person, that's when it clicked. That's when I was like, whoa. I'm like, this is because when you pass something on, it has to be a part of you, right? So it's like I had to give part of it away to someone else. And it was like, I finally felt for the first time, like, oh my gosh, I'm really okay with this. I'm really okay with who I am. I'm part of this, and I'm inviting someone new into the story, right? So I think that that's part of identity, is being able to have enough of it to be able to give it down to the next person in line, to the next generation, or the person who doesn't have these stories, who needs it to fulfill a part of their life. So yeah, it's funny. I thought that all of this research, figuring it out, pulling it all together, I thought that I would find identity in learning how to cook, learning how to speak the language, learning every family member and all of their histories. I thought that would help me find identity. And what helped me find identity was giving it away to the next person.
That's beautiful. It was a very remarkable act of service and love to do that for, the future generations. I am still very attached to my stuff, but I also feel that in some ways your history and the stories that you share in your podcast are also perhaps vital to the Ukrainian-Canadian perspective and the experiences of many people here who have similar histories, whereas my history is a little more kind of obscure and niche. I'm not sure there's an Irish, Scottish, Tamil, collective sort of organization here that would benefit from having anything that I've discovered. But in your case, you do. And I'm curious how you feel in Canada now and what kind of, supports and community exist here. And are you a part of those things? Or has your journey been very solo?
No, I wouldn't say it's solo. I would say that, so I think what you're touching on here is like, how I found, there's a Ukrainian-Canadian archive, where we archive, the lives of Ukrainians who came to Canada as immigrant settlers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at the University of Alberta. It's called the Cool Folklore Archive. And it is documents and, clothing and, just pieces of that life. There's even like a little pilgrim village, that you can go to, or you can see like old homes and, homesteads and stuff like that in Alberta. Like that's how important the Ukrainian community is out there. Because that community helped build and farm most of northern Alberta, right? Like north of Edmonton. So it's an important part of Canadian history. It's an important part of Ukrainian history. And I was able to donate all of the family documents and my photos, like just my entire family archive that I've been working on for 20 years. I donated it to that archive for scholarly purposes, for the use of students, like, who are writing papers at school and just doing general research on that time period, that way of life, that part of Canadian history. And it's very important to me and my family that we had the opportunity to do that. Like you were saying, there aren't many places in the world where there are specific archives held in other countries for, like there's no Indian archive in Ireland for what you are talking
Right.
about. Potentially, I don't know. Maybe there is. Maybe we just don't know about it. But no, the Ukrainian community in Canada is a really big community. Actually, we have the most immigrant Ukrainians in any, other than in Ukraine, in any other country in the world, live in Canada. And most of them live in Western Canada or have lived in Western Canada. So being able to contribute to that history with my family's documents, my family who are just regular everyday people, who were just regular farmers, who were just regular immigrants who came over. It's really important. And I think what connection we're making now to like why it's important to Ukraine or just important to Canada is that in a country like Ukraine that is again being suppressed and being bombed every day and losing some of its cultural places and maybe even some of its history, there's a place here in Canada that's holding it safe for them.
Wow. That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. So I know we've talked about the ancestral trauma of the Ukrainian heritage, but I also know that you've touched a little bit on the resilience, the ancestral resilience. And I know that Ukrainians, even though I don't know much about Ukraine or Ukrainians, I do have in my mind this idea that Ukrainians are very hardworking and that there is enormous resilience, be it that they've like changed hands so many times and there's been like you said, so much suppression and just changing of country. And I wonder for yourself, like, what have you discovered in your inherited strengths that have come from your lineage?
I mean, yeah, I think that I could simply say like, oh, Ukrainians are so resilient and I'm of those people. And, I share, like, I have resilience. I'm a strong person, but I didn't grow up there. I didn't have the traumas that they had. I'm a granddaughter of immigrants who did. And they didn't share their traumas with me. I mean, they exhibited them, but they did not pass them down as like lessons. So anything that I have is anything that I am is because of the life that I've had in Canada. However, that is because of their sacrifice. So I don't know. Do I have these shared strengths, with my ancestors? I'm sure that I do. I can find similarities in their stories, and I love doing that. I love thinking about how I'm like them in some way. They're just like their traumas. I'm not claiming their traumas as my traumas. I can't claim their successes as my successes either. I can't claim their resilience as my resilience. Just like there's a self-made, and I guess mine is too.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. And I know that you're coming, from a lot of storytelling background. Do
Mm-hmm.
you think that your sort of storytelling journey with your ancestors has opened up any spiritual dimension with
Mm-hmm.
ancestral work? Like, do you feel the presence of your ancestors, or has there been any other experiences that you feel have been spiritual in nature?
Oh, more than ever. More than ever. If anything, I feel like I feel like I'm surrounded by them all the time. I don't think I ever felt like that before, doing all this and like learning their story. And it's really hard to not feel connected once you know someone's story, right? It's really hard to not care once you know how somebody lived. And I wish that they were here with me, like in this life, but I'll have to settle for the feeling that I have that they're walking alongside me.
I think they are. And I have the feeling they're very proud of what you've done with their story. And like you've touched on, their stories are so, simple and everyday working class people. They're not kings and queens. But I think the fact that you've somehow immortalized them in your archives and in the podcast and in the other work that you're doing is,
Well, who else is going to do it?
Yeah, who else is going to do
right?
it?
And
exactly.
I think but that's not just for my family. That's for everyone's family. Like, you know what I mean? If you're not going to take pride in your own family, who else is going to do it? Right? If you're not going to if no one else is coming to tell your family story. So
absolutely.
I think it's just open for everyone. I think that that's part of the reason why we have families is, so we can carry on these legacies, these stories, these, cultural ways of life. Like who's going to do it if you don't do it? So.
And was there anything that completely surprised you in your ancestral archival work?
Mm-hmm. There was actually, and I love this story. It's so for years, and I mean, I mentioned this a little bit in the podcast. This is episode 5. It's called the Melnick sisters. For my whole life, my great grandmother and her sister, their names are Anastasia and Maria. Their last name is Malik, and I'd seen their name written many times just in family documents as Melnick. These are 2 very different last names. Melnick and Malik, one of them means small and one of them means miller, right? So they're basic, common last names. Those are just the Ukrainian translations. But they're very different. Those are not the same last name. So I always wondered why they had 2 last names written down. And I learned over time that it's just, sometimes transliterations, when people are crossing borders, that they, would say them wrong, or they would say, oh, we're familiar with this last name and your last name sounds similar. So they would write it down. And then sometimes you never looked at your paperwork again. You immigrated to a country and that's what your name was on that document that went to the government. And what I learned was that there was these sisters that kept on traveling back and forth to Canada for like 10 years with with something called the Sisters of Service, which is a convent in Ontario, Canada, that would travel out to the prairies of Alberta and help settlers in the early 1900s. And now my great-grandmother, Anastasia, and her sister Maria were teenagers during this time, but I kept on seeing them come up on documents together, coming from the same villages, with the same names, but sometimes they were Melnick and sometimes they were Malik. And I was like, oh, it's probably not the same girls. And I just let it go. And I was like, okay, they've never been to Canada before. They finally immigrated here in 1925. But the documents never went away. There's still documents from like 1911, 1916, 1919, where they were traveling. And I'm like, who has the money to travel back and forth? And why are they traveling with a convent? They weren't nuns, right? So at least as far as I knew. So I keep on doing all this research. And then one day I was going to New York City for a trip. And I went with my sister and we went and saw Ellis Island. And we came home and I was telling my mom all about the trip. And she says, well, did you look for your ancestors there? And I said, no, because we don't have any American ancestors. And she's like, yeah, but why didn't you look? Like it's worth a look, right? Just to see. And I looked and I found my great-grandmother, Anastasia, coming with her father at age 16 to Canada and then leaving again. She came multiple times to set up a homestead. At least that's what we believe, because she did eventually come to Canada and set up a homestead when she was married with her sister. And I thought that it was really fascinating that was the first time I found proof of it, because her father was listed on the same document as her. They were from the same village that I have them from. The ages were right. The year was right. And they were coming to take a train from New York City to Canada because they were going out to the prairies for a visit. And I never would have been able to put two and two together if I hadn't looked at that one Ellis Island document, which I think is so fascinating. So
That is amazing.
the
I remember. Yeah.
whole story hinged on that one document, just proving that she had gone, because it was just so unusual to hear of family members traveling multiple times across the ocean. Like most people travel and they never go back. She went several times, in an effort to prepare. And then her father died and he never got to come over. And I think that was part of the story. So, I mean, the most I could put together was that the family was trying to afford and trying to set up a homestead there. And then their patriarch died. And my great-grandmother, who was unmarried at the time, and her younger sister, and they were poor. They had no money out there. They immigrated to Canada together. And they're the reason why we're here, right? Like those are my pioneering ancestors who came here. And I think it's just really funny that I found that one document in a place where you'd think it wouldn't have been. I have no American relatives, but it was there. And because at the time, people would travel to the United States and then take trains into Canada as opposed to coming to Pier 21. Pier 21 didn't open until 1928, and she was traveling there in like 1911. So where would she have gone? I just assumed that they would have come to Canada. It was never a thing I thought about. I didn't even consider that they wouldn't have come. Like, that's the easiest way to do it, but they didn't do things easy back then. So she would go to New York, and just like you'd see in movies, right? You know, just Statue of Liberty coming through Ellis Island, you know, with like 20,000 immigrants a day. Like, it was insane.
It's an incredible story.
Mm-hmm. But that's the funny thing, is that it could be just anybody who's kind of stuck on something. You know, you're stuck looking for some connection, some little bit of proof that, you know, a theory you have is correct. Like, you know, the answer could be in a place that you wouldn't even expect. Like, mine was right out in the open. So
I have no doubt that your ancestors were somehow helping you to piece these things together. And, you know, as I think about all of the ways that you've researched your lineages and all of the information that you've put together, it's brought up this like question for me also around what is the future of archival work? Because it seems like in the modern day, we're kind of archiving everything in real time. Like I've got a massive digital footprint. I'm sure you do too. We've got, you know, pictures and audios and all kinds of things just all right here. And so I wonder for the future generations, like, will they have the opportunity to make sense of the stories the ways that we are with our past, with our ancestors from the past, where we had to go on these sort of, you know, big journeys to find things like that? What do you feel could be the future of archival work?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the future will be like as far as what the medium will be. Because you know, as you were talking, I was just thinking, I was like, you know, there's so many things that will be answered for future generations just because of the way that we take photos, the way that we digitize things, the way that every photo you take on your phone is time-stamped. You know, we'll never have to wonder when it was taken. I don't want to say there's facial recognition, but like you probably could, you know, use that in the future to find your family. However, in the past, how did people find their families? Like, and you know, what mediums changed for them? Like before photography, you didn't even have a photo. Like you didn't even have a photo of these people. You just had a name on a piece of paper if you were lucky, right? To be able to even remember that. But you would have these word of mouth stories, right? You know, like in making it full circle again on the Kobzar. I'm imagining that people had to be the Kobzars of their families back then too, you know, to just pass along like who was your great great grandfather? Like, do we even know his name? Like, I bet it was just you know, holding all that information verbally, like giving it to people verbally is what I mean, is was probably the way that they did it. And then they got photography, and they could say, oh, point to a person, that's who they are, write their name down. And then after that, now we have cameras that do all of that for us already. You know what I mean? So how will they make sense of it, I think, is the future. You know what I mean? Like and I don't even mean like, how will they make sense of like who these people are? It's going to be pretty simple for them to figure it out. I think it's, what does it mean to me? Because they're going to be inundated with so much. You know, and I'm thinking like 100 years from now, right? If 100 years from now, one of my great nephews or nieces got a hold of my photo archive and was like, what does this mean? right? Like, why is this important to me? Why was she keeping this? Like, that is the kind of thing they're going to have to try and figure out. What's the importance of it? Because back then, the importance of a family photo was to identify who they were. And now we have so many family photos. We have every trip ever. Whereas back then, if somebody took a photo, on a trip, it was because it was the only trip they went on in their whole lives. And like now we go on trips all the time and we're constantly documenting everything. So what's important and what's not? What's the story and what's not the story? That's what I think the problem with the future is going to be, is they're going to be like, I don't know how to figure out what's important and what's not.
That's so true. I love that idea.
I don't know if it's a problem. Is it a problem? I don't know. Too much information. Is it a problem? Maybe.
No, I mean, I suppose I feel like what we've done with our lives has been fun for us to some degree, right? I mean, you spoke to the punishment also, but it has been also meaningful because we have these kind of investigative personalities. We want to get to the bottom of things and find stuff out. So I feel like maybe people won't have as much of that opportunity because it's kind of all there. But I do agree. It's still about making meaning with it. And you still, even with all that information that you have, what does it really mean to you personally, right? So I think that's a good point. And also a great question for you. Like, what does all of this mean to you? What has this journey taught you about home and belonging and your life?
I mean, how it makes me feel right now is it makes me feel way more centered in my life. I feel really grateful. I feel like I'm a part of something. Like I've come from somewhere. The places and the people that my family has been. I like knowing that I'm part of that. I'm not saying that the story of my family is done and that it's like completely resolved and everything, I've put a bow on it and it's finished and it's a gift and it's like, it is all those things, but it'll never be done, like I said. But what it has done is it's really inspired me to want to tell other people's stories, or at least help people understand why they should tell their own stories. At least if I'm that person yelling from the rooftops, it's like, it's okay to research your family. Like, don't be afraid of what's out there. Face it head on, that kind of stuff. I just feel like it's so rewarding to do that. It can be hard, but it is rewarding in the end. And the rewards, they ripple through time. So, I mean,
agreed.
That's what I've taken from it. I think I'd like to help other people tell their stories.
Well, and I think that's a great place for maybe our last question is like, what is next for you now that this podcast series is behind you? I know there's going to be a lot of celebrating. I can imagine that that's going to be so fun for you and your family. And what is next for you on a professional and personal level now that this is done?
Well, I have a couple of things that I want to do. I have a couple of things I want to do with my life. I want to write a television show, not necessarily about my family, but something in the same vein. And I'd like to publish a book one day about this journey. I know it is a podcast, but I'd like to make it more of a firm storytelling, a continuous book, something permanent that can sit on a shelf somewhere. But yeah.
That's amazing. I think that's great. I will have that book on my shelf.
No.
I am so grateful to you, Erika, for being on this show. I just absolutely loved your podcast, and I will certainly link it for folks listening here because I think it is just remarkable storytelling and so beautifully produced.
Thank you.
And the story is wonderful. And so I really hope people will go and give it a listen. You are also on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook and Substack, and I will certainly link all of those things in the show notes. Is there something else that you would like to share before we wrap up our conversation?
Just to anybody out there who is searching for family and searching for, trying to build that family tree, take the breaks when you need them, but never give up the quest. I think that it's a lifelong pursuit. And if you stick with it, like I said, it ripples throughout time. So hang in there.
I love that. Hang in there. Thank you so much, Erika.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to The Long Road Home, a podcast for travelers, storytellers, and culture makers, exploring the roots that shape us and the roads that lead us home. I'm Yamuna. See you on the road.